Welcome and thanks for tuning in to the fourth in our EY Oceania LinkedIn series, Transformational Change, and we are coming to you live. Now, throughout this conversation, please do join in by adding your questions into the chat pane, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can within this half hour. Now, so far in this live series, we've explored the topics of economics and ethics, well-being and culture, resilient working, and today we're looking at the new imperative for change, and we're exploring that in the context of climate change. So it certainly should make for a meaty discussion. Now, with COVID dominating so much of our thinking at the moment, climate change has in some ways felt like the less visible threat. But even pre-COVID, just in January of this year, it was clearly listed as a top 10 risk by the World Economic Forum, and still so many organisations have been slow to act. But in fact, environment is the mother of all threats. It's the most pressing economic and societal challenge facing us globally. And we've now passed a climate change threshold. There will be clear winners and losers in how we respond, and that's going to require change, collective change. But let's take a moment to look at this with an optimistic lens. If we can embrace the speed of change that we've experienced with COVID in 2020, and we could be prepared to apply that across the board, this could actually be a once-in-a-generation opportunity for us to rethink and reprioritise long-term value creation and enable the kind of global collective action for climate change that to date we just have not been able to harness. So business needs to look at climate risk in a new way, and we need to turn our plans into actions, and we need to change how we change. So over the next half hour, I'll be joined by two guests. We'll have Matt Bell, EY Asia Pacific Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader, and Adam Canwell, EY Oceania Workforce Advisory Leader. So once again, welcome to the EY Oceania LinkedIn live series, Transformational Change. Adam, I want to start with you. You're working with organisations and leaders every day. I'm interested in your view on my favourite topic, which is change. I think COVID has actually served to be a fantastic myth buster for us around our propensity to change and the speed with which we can do it. What do you think it is about the pandemic that's mobilised us?
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. I think there are a couple of really interesting things about the impact of the pandemic and therefore our view on change. As a practitioner who's spent a lot of time in this space, I think what the pandemic has showed us, 2 years to drive a significant change program and get behavioural shift is just not necessary. In a matter of hours, most organisations across Oceania radically shifted our ways of working, went virtual, used digital technology in a different way. And as we did it, we busted an enormous amount of paradigms that have been held true in organisations for decades, if not a century. And I think there is a really important question there, is that how did we engineer a change so rapidly, so quickly? I think there are 3 or 4 things that were important about it. First of all, of course, the change territory was uncontested. We all saw an existential threat in front of us. And certainly at the beginning of the crisis, that was an uncontested territory where we had to shift really quickly to deal with it. So the territory was uncontested. There was an incredible sense of urgency. We had to act quick. People had clarity, like they knew where they were going. They knew what shift they were expected to make, go virtual, work digitally. And also we had to be in it together. Like collective was actually a really critical piece of the response. And those 4 conditions, of course, made the space possible for us to then make radical shifts to our operating rhythms, our ways of working. I think the question going forward, and particularly as you then take that out to the bigger threat, which is the climate threat, is how do leaders create that uncontested space with a sense of urgency around it?
Great points there, Adam. And I might actually, on that note, throw to you, Matt. Adam's spoken a lot about just then around existential threats, paradigm shifts, the contestability of threats, collective action. I'm interested in how we take those learnings that Adam's spoken about and translate them to climate change. And I might, Matt, just before you get into the answer for that, get you to set the scene for us in terms of where we are currently at with climate change globally, and then how we take some of those lessons across.
Yeah, thanks, Janelle. And look, they're great points, Adam, and it's a good question, Janelle, in terms of where we are, because I don't think many people realize. So we obviously have a global consensus of a need to reduce emissions to keep us to within 2 degrees of warming. Around 188 countries now have signed up to the Paris Accord, including Australia and New Zealand. And what that means is we would need to decarbonize the global economies by around the mid-century, so around 2050. At the moment, we're not on target to hit 2 degrees. We're somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees of warming, which is what's deemed catastrophic climate change. And so we actually do need to reduce emissions by around 8% a year, every year for the next decade to get us back onto track. Put that in context with COVID-19, we don't know those numbers yet, but we actually don't predict that the amount of reduction in emissions we'll see because of the disruptions of COVID-19 will even be 8%. And so that's the sort of quantum of change we expect to see, and yet clearly we don't want that change to occur in the same way. So to Adam's point, this has to be an uncontested space, both from a leadership and a collective perspective, if we're going to get this right.
Thanks, Matt. And you make the point about leadership. So let's just turn to you, Adam, on that topic of leadership, specifically transformational leadership. When a leader's worldview is challenged and they're forced to reframe the way they see the world, do you think this crisis, and indeed the kind of transformational leadership that we're seeing through the crisis, do you think that provides us with an opportunity to build a brighter, greener future?
Yeah, I do, and I think there's a really important piece about what the crisis has done to us that creates this space where leaders can truly shift. My experience is when you talk about transformational leadership, to really get a transformation in a leader or what a leader is doing, how a leader acts, to some extent, you've got to shatter their worldview. I work with senior leaders all the time, and in some ways, we're victims of our own success in that we create ways of seeing the world that are very successful and have got us as far as they've got us. So we create a set of beliefs, assumptions, ways of working that have been very successful and got us to where we have got to. What they also do is constrain the way that we see the world works. So we have very strong mental models based on success. The only way that you can release yourself from the grip of those mental models is by shattering the way that you see the world. And what this crisis has done for all of us, it shattered our conception of the world. It shattered our conception of organization and the way that companies are run. And I think one of the most important pieces about this is it really has shown us how fragile the external environment truly is, and how we are all at the whim of nature, and therefore we need to pay closer attention. So that shattering of worldview is critical, and there's been a really important shattering of our worldview of our environment.
Thanks, Adam. And with that in mind, back to you, Matt. You talked about decarbonisation. Decarbonising the economy is definitely going to be one of the biggest economic transformations of humanity. It will affect business models. It will disrupt entire value chains. And I think in terms of impact, it's got to be right up there with the first industrial revolution. So with that kind of mind shift and that shattering of thoughts as Adam just spoke about in action, what kind of shift in action and mindset do you think we need from our leaders and our boards to drive that mega trend of decarbonisation?
Yeah, it's a good question again. I mean, I think it's a big mind shift change. So to your point, it's my belief that climate change is the largest economic transformation we're going to see in our generation. And we are starting to see a range of stakeholders change their view on the need for action in the very near future. We can look at Generation Z, Janelle, right? That's archetyped by Greta Thunberg and her action on climate change, but it's actually representative, as we know from our recent megatrends report, but it's representative of the biggest issues that the Generation Z feel that they're going to face. Now, they are creating a grassroots movement and it's bottom up, but that's not enough, right? We actually need to change the paradigm in the leadership within organizations, both board and senior management of organizations, because it's going to be those business leaders who need to undertake the sort of analysis we know they need to undertake, thinking through what the physical and transitionary changes of climate change are likely to be under a range of scenarios to their business, so that they can steer them over the long term in the right direction. They're going to have to rapidly decarbonize their businesses, alongside consider what the rapid decarbonization of their overarching supply chain and their customer base is going to be. It's really hard to underline it any more clearly of just how big a change it's going to be and just what sort of leadership we'll need from the top.
It's a fascinating point, Matt, when I reflect on that comment there, and I think about the congruence, or the confluence of a range of megatrends that are going on right now. So as you say, this is a time of huge demographic shifts and the rise of Gen Z in particular. I think it's particularly interesting, as you've said, that climate change tops the list of global priorities for Gen Z, but also that half of Gen Z live in countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change, and at the same time, those same countries report as being or having low readiness to respond to it. So it's really interesting to see that sort of groundswell, the grassroots change that you're talking about, that rise in social consciousness and what that's going to do for action. So I will turn actually back to you, Adam, and stay on the topic of mindset shift. I've heard you speak about the need for societies and for companies to be able to shift their underlying belief systems rapidly when there's a major disruption. By that, with mindset shift, we're thinking about the implicit things that guide our behaviour, the things that are deeply embedded in our cultural norms. What do you see as the role of leaders here?
Yeah, I critical, of course. If you look at it, go back to the COVID crisis, we had a whole set of assumptions that governed our behaviour, that physical space was important for an organisation. We had to be face to face. We had to be next to each other. COVID has completely altered all of those perceptions about how we worked and ways of working in organisations. So there's a set of assumptions that always govern our behaviour, and leaders need to be hyper aware of what assumptions are governing behaviour in organisations. And at the right times, they need to be challenging and shattering those assumptions so the organisation can move to a different way of working, a different way of being. Bringing this to life, I remember in 2005 working with a directory company in the UK, and we were trying to create a new strategy for the organisation. So this is 2005. I think Google has existed for about 7 years, and there wasn't one conversation that the exec team wanted to have about Google, which was incredible. Their organisation was being destroyed by this new competitive startup in the digital space. Their reaction was actually to just increase the velocity of print runs to bring more revenue in, rather than radically shifting the organisation to become a digital organisation. And the point there was the organisation was hooked on being a print-led organisation to get advertising out and get people into organisations. What they needed to say was actually there's been a dramatic shift in our external environment. What does that mean for us? And what are the assumptions we've got to unpick to compete and thrive in this new environment? And the role of leader there was to see the external threat and then shift the organisation to deal with the external threat. They just weren't seeing the external threat quickly, and then they weren't shifting the assumptions of the organisation. And that's true with our deep addiction to carbon. Every organisation is going to have to fundamentally look at its underlying assumptions that drive a need for carbon if we're going to come through this. And that's the role of leaders, and we've got to get to it quickly.
No, that's a fantastic example, Adam. I think, those underlying assumptions very often can also include the assumption that what got us here will get us there. And I think that's one of the biggest debilitating assumptions to have in an organization, and that willingness, the humility, maybe the paranoia to keep questioning, what's changing and how do I change in that. So for anyone who's just joined, we're live and we're discussing climate change and the new change imperative. Just a reminder, please do add your questions in the chat field. And as I said, we'll try to get to as many of those as we can in the remainder of our time. So Matt, just a question to you in terms of the opportunities that you think COVID has now opened up for us in the climate change space.
Thanks, Janelle. I was reflecting as Adam was talking about the directories example, that businesses are by nature caught in this perpetual motion, as we all are as workers, right? And COVID actually has been the first time, at least, in my working life, that we've taken a hard stop. We've been made to take a hard stop, reconsider what's appropriate in our lives, in our working lives, in our home lives, and adjust appropriately. It's done that especially in relation to climate change. So, and I probably should mention, of course, that climate change, whilst it is a massive change, and if we get things entirely wrong, the risks are profound. With any change, opportunity exists. We know so much about climate change. It's one of the most well-studied phenomena, and so we have all of these great scenarios, and we have predictive capability of what different scenarios could look like at a local and a global level. And yet, we haven't really taken the opportunity to stand back and say, well, okay, what are those upsides? How do we steer our organizations? How do we steer our countries in the right direction? And COVID has actually done that. So in a couple of ways, we've started to see obviously a huge amount of government funding to support this crisis in the near term, but also set us up for the long term. The European Commission's a great example. They are tying around 750 billion euros worth of investment right now to green outcomes. So you can only access that money if you're able to demonstrate that there are green outcomes. And actually 1 in 4 euros has to go to climate action. So their stimulus packages are trying to drive the European Union towards a low carbon net zero future because they see long-term economic advantage in it. And it's not just, governments and related institutions. Institutional investors globally are also telling us that they care about this. So we had our survey results from our EY Global Institutional Investor Survey just a week ago. And that was during the COVID crisis when we went out and surveyed, nearly 300 institutional investors globally. And what they came back with is that they are doubling down on ESG performance. They're assessing it more than they ever have. They are tying their decision-making into things like climate risk. So nearly 75% of investors, for example, told us that they're either going to be reconsidering or moving away from investments on the basis of climate risk. That's unprecedented. And that's not changing. That's only going to strengthen over time. So now is the real opportunity to put organizations in a position where they are maximizing the benefits from understanding what the decarbonized economy looks like and steering the ship in the right direction. They're going to attract the right capital. They're going to attract, as you said, Janelle, the right generation, that nearly 1 in 4 people on Earth who in the next decade or so will be in the Generation Z. It just makes a lot of sense to be seeing it as an upside.
No, I think it absolutely does make a lot of sense. And I am quite buoyed and gratified to hear some of those shifts that you've talked about. But the risk of sounding a little bit more pessimistic on that front, maybe throw this one to you, Adam. One of the challenges I do think that we face still is probably something that's both structural and behavioural, and it's a tendency towards short-termism. Notwithstanding some of those great examples that Matt just gave then, I do think en masse we do tend to skew towards short-termism. It does skew the way that we view risk. It does skew the way we prioritise our time and our money. Adam, how do you think we need to go about addressing that short-termism?
Yeah, really important space. There's been quite a lot of research over the past few years that has shown that the time horizons that senior leaders, both in government and private sector, are looking at the world through have shrunk, really shrunk rapidly. You get less 30 to 40 year big programmatic thinking in government. Organizations are kind of trapped in a much shorter time cycle. I think there are some things that underlie that. The hyper competition in most industries means that you have to have a really short-term view. Activist shareholders, driving quarterly results has impacted on management teams, and in most organizations we still have backward-looking performance systems that are looking at previous quarter results rather than really forward-looking performance systems. And of course, all of that is amplified in a crisis, where naturally our time horizon shrinks because of kind of very real threats and fears. I think, but the evidence, of course, does show that value creation is always a long-term view, and organizations that have better long-term planning, it deeply embedded into their management systems, thrive much more effectively. They're looking 10 to 15 years out, using scenarios to inform today's actions. They're planted firmly looking forward, so they know what's coming at them, and therefore they're able to actually be much more agile in the now. The kind of paradox of long-term thinking is it helps much quicker short-term action. So I think the challenge here is how to boards and execs spend much more time scenario planning based on long-term future trends, and then using that to inform today's action, to come away from some of the short-termism that doesn't allow us to make the shifts we're going to need to make.
It's interesting. Thanks, Adam. It just makes me think about a series we've been doing actually during COVID. We've been running a series of discussions with a range of CEOs, just trying to understand how they are spending their time. This is purely around COVID considerations. However, we ask them to rate their time spent in a now versus next versus beyond time frame. And interestingly, 5 months ago, it was probably 70, 20, 10 time allocation of now, next and beyond. 5 months later, it's more like 30, 40, and 30 sort of split. So people are really shifting their time. And I'm thinking that the understanding of the need to work across multiple time horizons and adjust those is starting to really come in centre frame for leaders. Matt, I'm interested in your perspectives on short-termism and time horizons of leaders as they prioritise their actions.
Yeah, I'm really interested in those results, actually, Janelle. I think, and it's really positive, right? Because I think, again, comes back to this concept of leaders in business having the opportunity to think longer term because they've been forced to do that for the first time in a while. And we know that current functions in organizations tend not to set people up for success in terms of thinking long term. So risk strategies and broader strategic intent of organizations tends to think at best out to 5 years. And yet some of these existential crises or opportunities that we face, whether that's climate change or technology disruption, can be out over the longer term. So, I think there is a need for organizations to go through a process of thinking longer term and then running appropriate scenarios but behind those. But yeah, so it's definitely true. I mean, the one thing we do know, of course, is that there is now a growing body of evidence that shows organizations that are run more sustainably and think about value over the long term, and they tend to be the companies who are purpose-led, because the purpose is a long-term purpose, not something hinged on a short-term strategy. They're actually outperforming the marketplace. So the evidence is there. Now we just need to see more action.
Okay, well, let's just stay on that question around purpose, but Adam, I'll bring you into this one. What do you see when we think about purpose? Aspiration grounded in humanity that inspires a call to action. Tell us about what role you see purpose as having.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I think where you and Matthew are going is exactly right. Purpose for me is critical on several levels. First of all, purpose articulates an organization's direction in the long term. So it thinks much longer term. It thinks about the impact of an organization on multiple stakeholders. So it comes away from narrow definition of success through financial success. And it brings to life the why of the organization and the belief system of the organization. And I think there's loads of that that's really important. And when we're thinking about how do you really make change happen, when we're talking about that, what we're talking about is how do we get people to change their behavior? People will change their behavior when they believe in something. And so to have a fundamental belief at the heart of your organization that you believe in, that your people believe in, that brings to life you in a much more meaningful way than short-term shareholder returns is critical. And that has to encompass long-term sustainability and your impact on the environment for it to be true. So I think you can't make a significant shift in your people quickly unless you've got that belief and that trust across your workforce.
Thank you, Adam. We've now got some questions coming through from our audience via LinkedIn. So let me just throw to you, Matt. There's a couple that have come in for you. Well, I'm throwing them to you anyway. One question is, what are the steps we need to take to encourage governments and companies to go carbon neutral now versus 2030, or even in the longer term? Before you get into it, I'm going to push that question a little harder and say, is carbon neutral even enough? Should we be pushing for harder than that? So maybe that's the first part of the question, and then our audience member has asked what we need. What are the steps?
Yeah, they're challenging questions because, of course, the short answer is carbon neutrality isn't enough because that only considers your impacts, your direct impacts, as opposed to how you interrelate with other organizations. We are actually seeing, though, a bit of a groundswell of activity, not just within our region, but globally around the need to look at carbon neutrality and even carbon positive. So going beyond that and creating a bigger impact. EY, for example, this year it was the first year that we announced we'd be carbon neutral globally, and we definitely don't want to diminish the importance of that because it is actually an important action, particularly for those sorts of organizations where they are incapable because of their business model of moving away directly from emitting activities. But it isn't enough. I mean, what we know is that we are not on track. So we actually need to see more directive action from organizations, more collective action with government. So government and organizations partnering and working hand in hand towards the overarching objectives. We obviously need better targets, and we need a trajectory for decarbonization, greater certainty for business. This is what we constantly hear, again, particularly in our region, from business around the actions that they will take will be helped if they have certainty over the environment that they're heading into. But no, unfortunately, it's not enough, but it's a great start, and we're certainly seeing a lot of companies making that move, which I would continue to encourage.
Thanks, Matt. Another question in here for you. Do you think offsetting carbon footprints should be mandatory for businesses?
Mandatory is a hard word. Obviously, where you have a carbon price in place or an explicit carbon price in place, then in effect, people are paying for the costs of carbon to society. I don't think the carbon offsetting should be mandatory. I do think we need to have a regulatory and a policy environment which establishes the sorts of ground rules for business to operate in that enables them to get to decarbonization and also incentivizes growth and entrepreneurialism in the opportunity side here as well, because we're not just talking about the decline in industry sectors, we are talking about the fast and rapid rise in the industries or the subsector of those industries that are going to replace them.
Thanks very much, Matt. Look, I think it's abundantly clear that COVID-19 has busted the myth of change being too big or too difficult. And we know that to tackle a crisis, the scale and complexity of climate change, it's shown us the importance of long-term thinking, and it's not just about immediate shareholder value. And as the world approaches 1.5 degrees of warming, companies that embrace the climate change challenge are going to secure the future. They'll improve their capacity to create long-term value for all stakeholders. And for those who aim to capture that innovation opportunity for generation, they're going to be perfectly placed. For instance, imagine a day when we're turning waste emissions into value with carbon inputs. So on that note, I want to thank you, Matt, thank you, Adam, for your insights and for making what sometimes feels like an impenetrable issue much clearer for us. Personally, I feel really buoyed by the lessons that we've had through COVID around our ability to make change happen. I feel buoyed by the rise in social consciousness that I think we're seeing in our generation and the generations behind us. And I feel buoyed by the proof points that we have in the power of collective action. So thank you for joining us. If you want to hear more on climate change and the change imperative, if you want to delve deeper into some thought leadership that we've developed around this area, please do drop us a note in the comments box or connect with us directly via LinkedIn. You can also access the EY website, and that features rolling commentary on our latest thinking and analysis covering a range of business-related issues. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you again soon.